When you deal with names, it's important to recognize that names carry significance. I think everybody knows that when they get ready to name their children, and most people know that when they take time to name anything. But in the Bible, names have this important meaning, not just for the child and this longing that this child would embody this meaning, but they also seem to have significance for the families and the parents in the moments that this child emerges into their life. In Genesis 41, we find Joseph having risen from slavery, which his brothers sold him into, to leading the largest nation in their region, this huge, massive country of Egypt, gathering grain and preparing for a coming famine that God had revealed to him in a dream. And in this chapter, there is a small paragraph that records how Joseph named his children. The firstborn, in verse 51, Joseph names Manasseh, and he gives us a little insight because he actually even tells us why he named him that. He says that it is because God has made me forget all of my troubles and all of my father's household. So there's this moment as Joseph is rising up where somehow God causes him to forget in this wound that has been opened from the travesty of his family selling him into slavery. There is this moment when God causes him to forget. And the name Manasseh actually means, it's a reference to when a stinger is left in from a bee sting, and that sting is removed from the wound. As long as that agitator stays in the wound will remain open. But Joseph is looking back to this moment and saying, God has given me this freedom from this hurt in my past, and he names his first son to reflect that. And moving on, he names his second son Ephraim, and then gives this explanation that it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. And so in these two moments, this moment when Manasseh is born and this moment when Ephraim is born, somehow these names not only carry weight and significance for the child, they carry weight and meaning for the family as they're going through that moment. And it was important for Amanda and I, as we began to decide about names and think about what God was doing in our lives and moving us not just into marriage, but then into the desire to have a family. It was important for us to consider the significance of what we were doing when we started to consider a name. Because we wanted to find something that not only reflected a hope and a longing that we had for our child, but we also wanted to find something that reflected the moment that we were in as a family. So Amanda and I had, since the very beginning, talked about the names that we would consider for our child when we were blessed by God and had the opportunity to have children. And she had picked out a girl's name, and I had kind of, along with her, picked out a boy's name. And then we met a family that we became very close friends with. And they had named their little girl this name that my wife had chosen. And there was this kind of recognition in Amanda and me that this name belonged to this little girl, and from that moment on we were not able to think about her in the way that we had without thinking of this name. So every time we thought about using that name, it just kind of took us right back to this girl, and we just believed that God had named her that and didn't want to steal that. And so we were driving up the road, and out of nowhere, without having any kind of time to process it, Amanda threw this question at me. I wasn't expecting it. At that time we weren't pregnant. We weren't expecting a child. And she asked me, Kevin, have you considered what we could name a girl? I don't think that name that we chose is going to work. That name belongs to that girl. We need a name that belongs to a girl if we have it. And in that moment, without thinking, something just went straight from my mind to my mouth, and I spoke this name. And it is a name that I had just a slight familiarity with, but I had never considered it in naming our child. And in that moment, it was just so sacred and holy, and Amanda looked at me and just felt like, yes, that's it. And there was a sense at that moment that this is exactly what God would have us name a little girl if we were so blessed to have a little girl. And it took months kind of to unpack that, because again, at that time we were not pregnant, we were not expecting a child. And so we continued to process and to think about what this name meant. What is this thing that God has given us, this name? What does this actually truly point to? And it became more sacred and more sacred because it became more evident that God Himself had given us a name for our little girl. So I guess it's time to actually finally share her name. The best way to share her name is really to walk through the parts of her name and put them together so that you can see the meaning. The first part of her first name, it's not a hyphenated name. It just has several parts that God kind of put together when I blurted it out as we were driving down the street. The first part comes from a very ancient name. It's actually used several times early in the book of Genesis, and that's the name Ada. Ada can mean kind of a beautiful adornment, something that has been ascribed beauty, but the most common etymology of the name means a beautiful gift. So it just seems so fitting for me, for Amanda, that this name begins with this sacred term, this sacred name that means a beautiful gift. The second part of this first name comes from another very historical surname out of the Hebrew text, out of the scriptures. And it's a shortened version of the word Lael. Lael is a word of origins. It actually speaks to where something is coming from. And it actually takes it a step further in its approach and ascribes the origin to God. So Lael means to originate or to come from God. So her name, when put together, means this beautiful gift that is from God, which is perfect as you describe where we are right now in life. Because many of you have taken time to watch Amanda's testimony online. And for our church folks, you saw it, you were there, you've lived this experience with us, and you know that in this moment, this is a beautiful gift from God. We struggled a little bit with what to give her as a middle name, because there's such sacred meaning in that first name, and we wanted to kind of give this weighty, significant meaning throughout the whole name. And so in that we kind of took some time to process it and look where we, just like Joseph did, to look where we are in life right now and what is significant for us. And so we settled on the name Grace. We settled on the name Grace because when we think about this little girl and the gift, not just of a child, but just of the pregnancy itself, when we think about it, it is such a gift of God's grace. We have done nothing to earn it. It is purely unmerited. But it also speaks to where we are in life. Many of you know the struggles that Amanda and I have had over the last several years as she's been sick, and our family dynamic and roles have changed at home. It's been one of those circumstances where over the past few years, where we are, we have learned to share grace with one another, to give grace, to receive grace. And so her name is this beautiful gift from God that is grace. And that it definitely speaks to our little girl and the pure, great, awesome gift that she is. But it also speaks to where we are in life right now. It also speaks to the fact that we have learned that there is this beautiful gift from God that is grace, that God has extended to us, and that we, because of God's goodness and kindness, that we now get to extend that also to other folks, primarily to our spouse and in the future to our child. So it's my real sincere pleasure to get to share with you for the first time in a kind of broad spectrum the name of our child. Her name is Adelaide Grace. Adelaide Grace.